Okay, let's begin. Welcome everyone. My name is Arturo Baez, Digital Education Initiative Specialist at the Museum of Latin American Art. We welcome you today, Thursday, September 30th, 2021 to Chinese Mexicans and Mexicanidad with panelist Fredy González. This presentation is part of MOLA's Latinx Heritage Month celebration. In today's session, Dr. Fredy González from the University of Illinois at Chicago will give a brief history of Chinese immigration to Mexico during the 20th century and illustrate some of the ways that Chinese contributed to the claimed belonging to the Mexican nation. Fredy González is an associate professor of global Asian studies and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the author of Chinos, Trans-Pacific Politics Among Chinese Immigrants in Mexico. A Spanish translation of Chinos is forthcoming from Mexican press, Palabra de Clio. He is a heritage speaker of Spanish and fluent in Mandarin Chinese. In 2016, he was a Fulbright Scholar in Taipei, Taiwan. MOLA also acknowledges the support of the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, the Kenneth T. and Eileen L. Norris Foundation, and the Arts Council for Long Beach for the constant support of the educational programs at the Museum of Latin American Art. And once again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to use the dedicated chat section to post comments and ask questions, but also there's a dedicated Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And without further ado, Fredy, take it away.
Thank you, Arturo, for that lovely introduction. Thanks to Museum of Latin American Art for having me, for being there in the community. It's really lovely to see all of you virtually and to be able to present my work to this audience. Like Arturo said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and I look forward to the discussion. This project is drawn from a book that I wrote in 2017, like he mentioned, called Chinos. Arturo, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So I want to start with a couple of moments that I think show the Chinese Mexican community at mid-century and illustrate the ways in which they make sense of their position in Mexico vis-a-vis both like Mexicanness, Mexicanidad, but also China and Taiwan. The first is this one, which took place on October 20th of 1961 in International House in Taipei, Taiwan. And it was a visiting Chinese Mexican dance troupe that went to go perform. In traditional costumes, they performed Mexican dances like the China Poblana, wearing the China Poblana and traje de charro. They performed folkloric dances like the Jarabe Tapatío and other regional dances from the Mexican states of Jalisco, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. And in this way, they introduced the Taiwanese audience, almost certainly for the first time, to their own Mexican culture. You see the enthusiastic reception from the Taiwanese crowd. 1 week later, over 8,000 miles away in Mexico City, members of the same community donned the qipao dresses, carried Mexican and ROC flags, as well as banners of the Virgin of Guadalupe, you see up top at the center, and engaged with performing lion and dragon dances along the way on a pilgrimage to the Basilica of Guadalupe, Mexico's holiest Catholic shrine. Now, normally, we don't really have access to these images of Chinese Mexicans as literal standard bearers of Mexican culture. And so as a result, we really miss these brief but telling moments of how Chinese fit into the Mexican nation. Oftentimes people, when they hear about my research, are really surprised to hear that there are Chinese in Mexico at all. And so my goal for today is to get us to think a little bit more expansively about what it means to be Mexican, what it means to be Latino, and also just about immigration. Right? We often assume that immigration is to the United States, but really Chinese have settled all around the world, including in Latin America. I'm going to present two ideas. The first is that from their very arrival, Chinese were subject to pretty intense racism from people who wanted to ban them and deport them from the country, advancing a particularly destructive idea that in a country marked by mestizaje, that the Chinese would never fit in. The second idea is that despite the racism that they suffered, and this idea of mestizaje, this mixture of Spanish, African, and indigenous roots, the Chinese nevertheless found ways to successfully integrate themselves and to make an impact on the Mexican nation. Exploring the Chinese case, I think, will give us a window into how other people who are not from one of those three roots have ultimately fit into Latin America. And this includes not only the Chinese, but also Japanese, Koreans, Middle Easterners, Jews that have remade Latin America and amplified what it means to be Latino. Let me give you guys a quick overview of Chinese migration. Chinese immigrants to Mexico almost all came from southern China, from Guangdong province, and they formed part of a large wave of Cantonese immigration to the Americas. The Chinese of the Americas made a small but rapidly growing fraction of the 20 million Chinese who left China between the 1850s roughly and the 1920s. Coming from the same province and speaking similar dialects, it was easier for them to be able to link up with one another and to settle in the country together. We really begin to see Chinese migration to Mexico after 1882. And that's when the US passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring most Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. And so people really begin to see Mexico and Canada as alternatives. In this political cartoon, we see like Uncle Sam symbolized by the eagle, kind of shutting the door to Chinese immigrants. But we see them kind of using Mexico on the right and British Columbia on the left as alternatives to then ultimately come into the United States, right? And so this political cartoon reflects something early on that like beginning in 1882, people would go to Mexico and see it as a way station to come to the United States. That's something that, like, if you guys have been following the news, right, the news around Haitian immigrants passing through Mexico as a way station into the United States, that will seem really familiar. The US was hindered in preventing Chinese from coming into the country, in part because of the kind of long open border that we have between the two countries. But also, believe it or not, initially the Border Patrol couldn't really tell whether people coming across the border were Chinese or Mexican. And so sometimes Chinese people would dress themselves up in like indigenous clothing, like you see here, and learn a few token phrases, no sé inglés, something like that, soy mexicano, and they would try to sort of pass off to an immigrant inspector as Mexican. Mexicans at that point could come and go as they please. There were no restrictions on Mexican immigration, but the Chinese were excluded, right? And so it was advantageous to pass as Mexican. I love this picture. It's an exhibit from a report on immigrant smuggling of Chinese through Mexico. And the kind of point of this image was that it was really difficult to tell whether the people photographed were Chinese or Mexican. They just like looked too similar, right, for immigrant inspectors to be able to tell them apart. And here we see a buggy that was used for smuggling Chinese across the US-Mexico border. So in all of these ways, as Chinese are transiting through Mexico into the United States, they do what my colleague Evelyn Hudehart calls inventing undocumented immigration from Latin America, right? She says the Chinese were the first undocumented immigrants to come from Mexico, not the Mexicans themselves. And skip this image really quickly. In doing so, they have some of the perils that contemporary undocumented migrants face. Here is a political cartoon printed in Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1891, where we see a Chinese person, you can tell by the Q in the back of his head, dying of thirst in the Sonora Desert, right, as he tries to go from Mexico to the United States. So the kind of difficulty of that passage, the difficulty of the terrain, and the difficulty of passing as Mexican ultimately mean that larger and larger numbers settle in Mexico as a destination. And that is encouraged in 1899. Mexico and China sign a treaty of amity and commerce that allows for some limited migration between the two countries. So around the turn of the 20th century, Chinese people begin to arrive in Mexico directly. And they begin to arrive in larger and larger numbers. They engage in a variety of industries around Mexico. And this map shows some of the areas with small-ish Chinese populations, significant Chinese populations around the country. You notice that it's diffuse, the entire country. There's almost no region that doesn't receive Chinese migrants in some way, shape, or form, but it's often the periphery. So areas that are on the exterior of the country, not really central Mexico, but a lot of these areas in and around borders, or areas that had not really been settled before the 1870s. Those areas that are kind of newly expanded, those begin to receive Chinese migrants. And Chinese migrants often will participate in agriculture or extractive industries, or they'll provide support to those people. Let me give you guys a couple of examples. Mexicali, the Mexicali Valley and the city of Mexicali itself, incredibly young. Mexicali was founded in 1903, and its foundation was connected to the planting of cotton in the Mexicali Valley, right? So once it was irrigated, the valley itself kind of flourished for cotton cultivation. The Chinese participated in cotton cultivation in the Mexicali Valley and were recruited in large number because of that. Early on, the first decade of the 20th century, there were more Chinese than there were Mexicans in Mexicali, right? And Chinese themselves referred to Mexicali as Little Guangzhou or Xiao Guangzhou. In Torreon, they worked in the railroad and in the mines. In Monterrey, they worked in the construction of municipal public works projects. In the Yucatan, in Mérida, they worked in Henneken, which was a kind of booming industry during the early 20th century. In Tapachula and Chiapas, especially in and around Tapachula and what's called the Soconusco region of Chiapas, they worked in coffee cultivation. And so no matter for what reason they arrived, whether they arrived as laborers or initially for other reasons, they began to accumulate capital, and together with their own paisanos or other family members to be able to open up small businesses. And for most of them, this involved what are called general stores. In Spanish, you call them abarrotes, right? They're sort of like local corner stores that sell a little bit of everything. Chinese also founded laundries and cafes. And for areas that were just opening up, right, these services were very much in need and allowed for the Chinese to be able to thrive. So the foundation of these small businesses requiring very little startup capital allowed for the Chinese to be able to do quite well. One city that deserves mention early on is the city of Torreon, right? Also a pretty young city, also very much tied to the development of agriculture in the state of Coahuila. And what the Chinese did there is they founded a series of gardens to feed the local population. And so the Chinese word for Torreon is Taiyuan, and Taiyuan means vegetable garden. And so it shows the kind of impact of the Chinese role in that city. This is one of the haciendas the Chinese purchased with their own capital, owned by a man by the name of Wang Fung-chuk. This is a beautiful, extensive property showing the impact of Chinese farming in that city. In addition to these haciendas, Wang Fung-chuk, one of the wealthiest people in Torreon at the time, owned the Hotel del Ferrocarril in the city, 5 other hotels nearby, and he's helped operate the Mexico-China Banking Company, one of the only banks in the town. Unfortunately, a lot of what the Chinese had built up in Torreon just before 1911 was completely wiped out during a large massacre of Chinese in 1911. So over the course of a couple of days, 303 Chinese men, 5 Japanese are killed. Their businesses are completely ransacked and burned and devastated, right? And so it took the Chinese community itself in Torreon bounced back, but their businesses never quite recovered. So even after Torreon and after the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1911 and continued into 1917 and beyond, even while like the Mexican environment was pretty unstable and dangerous for Chinese people, the Chinese continued to arrive. In 1895, there were only about 1,000 Chinese people in the country. By 1910, they numbered around 13,000, about a third of them in Sonora. And by 1926, they reached 24,000. And by that point, they were the second largest foreign immigrant group in all of Mexico. These Chinese were almost always men, a fact that partially explains the prevalence of intermarriage between Chinese men and Mexican women. Out of the 24,000 recorded in 1926, only about 400 were women. And oftentimes, you know, like at abarrote stores or at laundries, Chinese shop owners would meet, come into contact with Mexican women and later on form partnerships or marriages. And, you know, people married for lots of different reasons. Love itself, of course. It also provided the Chinese with a sense of belonging, a sense of rootedness, right, in the communities in which they were. Despite, partially in part because of their success, beginning in 1911, there was an increased attention to the Chinese and an increased amount of resentment that crystallized into what we call the anti-Chinese movement. And that would culminate between 1931 and 1934 with the expulsion of 3/4 of the Chinese population in the country. So you get people who begin to publish books decrying the Chinese presence, and they combine both this like economic nationalism, the sense that the Chinese are doing way too well, that they're taking their wealth and they're sending it back to China, that they're building their wealth off of the backs of Mexicans, with this preoccupation about their like social status, right? That they're like degenerating the Mexican race, that they're like providing these unwelcome racial influences. Jose Ángel Espinosa is probably the most famous. He writes 2 books. One, El Problema Chino en Mexico, and the second, El Ejemplo de Sonora. Sonora, by that, decreed the expulsion of all of their Chinese residents in the state. And so what he was saying was the entire country should follow the example of Sonora and expel the Chinese. And he's really well known for all of these like just awful racist caricatures of the Chinese, right? That then became the way that people saw them for a really long time. Here on the upper left is this like accusation that the Chinese are producing food in these like really unhygienic conditions, and that, you know, the like sweat and grime that's in their businesses is making its way into the food that everyday Mexicans eat. On the bottom left, this accusation that the Chinese are taking all of the wealth that they're getting and sending it back to China, right? So it says, for each peso that you buy from a Chinese, 50 cents are taken to Shanghai, and the other 50 cents serve to chain and prostitute the women of your race. The upper left here is a depiction of opium, right? And you can see that the person ostensibly is a laundryman, but really is trafficking opium to Mexicans and making Mexicans dependent, addicted to opium. And then the bottom right is a depiction of gang warfare, the sense that if you let the Chinese in, then everybody is going to be in a much more dangerous position as a result. Right? So all of these images kind of color perceptions of the Chinese. They build up slow resentment against their presence in the country. And laws begin to attack their presence to try to initially make their lives really intolerable. They try to make it, for example, illegal for Chinese men to marry Mexican women. Some towns try to decree ghettos for the Chinese to live in, to say like if the Chinese are unhealthy, then they should be consigned to certain parts of town. They should be segregated from everybody else. And the impetus behind most of those laws was to just make life really intolerable for the Chinese, and hopefully the Chinese would leave on their own. Ultimately, what ends up driving them out is this law called the 80% law. The 80% law stipulated that the workforce for any business in Mexico had to be at least 80% Mexican. Sounds okay in theory, right? But this law was enacted specifically with its aim against the Chinese. Chinese often worked on their own or were even self-employed. And so it made it so that if any business hired one Chinese person, they had to hire an additional 4 Mexicans and to pay them a wage or to shut down their business, right? So after this law was enacted, these kind of like militia patriot groups began to take up weapons, and declaring the Chinese in violation of that law began to surround their businesses. They called it a boycott, but here we see, and this is also from Jose Angel Espinosa's book, we see a depiction of one of these quote unquote boycotts. The Mexican woman on the right is clearly trying to shop at a Chinese owned business, but is being deterred by the kind of force of arms, right? She's being scared away from this business and doesn't really see the virtue of that boycott. That's kind of what happened in Chinese businesses around the country, right? 2 or 3 people would have weapons, sometimes sticks, sometimes guns, and basically say nobody's going to shop in this Chinese business anymore until the Chinese business closed and those people moved away. And it got pretty extreme. Eventually, it led to the kind of looting of those businesses, of like quote unquote fines. All of these associations were completely outside the law, sort of sanctioned by the state. The state basically turned a blind eye, but they all acted with complete impunity. And Chinese protests basically led nowhere. So over the summer of 1931 and leading into the 1932 and 1933, despite the protests of regular Chinese people, of the Chinese consulate, of the United States, conditions were so intolerable, the Chinese ultimately mostly left. Ultimately, 3/4 of the Chinese population left the country, from about 40,000 to about 12,000 after. Some of the people who left were Mexican spouses of the Chinese and Mexican Chinese children. And so they were essentially refugees left with nothing from these movements. And these are a couple of pictures that I've dug up in Chinese periodicals of people arriving in Shanghai, right? Like absolutely penniless and in a condition of absolute abject poverty. This anti-Chinese movement in Mexico was world famous. There were stories about it in newspapers in English, Spanish, French, Chinese, like around the world. Just the kind of like barbarity, the atrocities that happened against the Chinese population at this time. A lot of work has been done on the anti-Chinese campaigns. My research deals with those who stayed. And I note that only just a few years after the conclusion of the anti-Chinese campaigns, they slowly began to settle into the country and to overcome the trauma that was the anti-Chinese movement. This, for example, shows that a little over 10 years after the campaigns were over, Chinese organized energetically to support both China and Mexico during the Second World War. In both cities, they organized military troops to march alongside Mexican soldiers. This is a picture of a Chinese troop in Mérida, in Yucatan. And here's a second one in Tijuana. Yeah, in Tijuana, where people organize militias and showcase their patriotism alongside Mexicans. Once the war was completed, Chinese and Mexicans celebrated together. All around the country, from Tijuana to Tampico to Chiapas. Um, I also note in my research the Chinese made a lot of contributions to Mexican society. And so in the time that I have left, I'll just highlight a couple of them. One is food. And before and after the anti-Chinese movement, Chinese had a really integral part in the production of Mexican food, contribute a few dishes that are known in Mexican food today, including the kind of pan chino, this like a steamed bread. Wherever they settled, they often had a really important hand in agriculture or in the production of food. And by the 1920s, it was estimated that Chinese controlled a controlling interest in grocery stores around the country. For example, in the city of Tampico, it was common for Chinese to be in charge of the majority of restaurants. The same thing in Mexicali, where the Chinese restaurants had really humble beginnings, were small, but eventually began to cater to non-Chinese, to Mexicans. In Mexico City, if any of you guys have been there are lots and lots of restaurants called cafés de Chinos, right? There were about 300 during the early 20th century. And these were coffee shops that sold both like Mexican food and also iterations of Chinese food for a Mexican clientele. By the 1940s, the image of the Chinese restaurateur had become fodder for stereotypes. So this is a kind of accusation from anti-Chinese people, right? That the food Chinese are producing is not necessarily good or sanitary food. So they're making the accusation that they're like making a chorizo, a Mexican sausage out of cats. I think that's a cat. This is a film that jumps out at me from the 1940s called Café de Chinos. And it's not necessarily like a fair, it's a pretty racist depiction of the Chinese presence. The lead actor is in yellowface and he portrays a character by the name of Senor Ching Chong. And he speaks Spanish with a really thick accent. He doesn't conjugate his verbs correctly. But nevertheless, like he owns this like Café de Chinos and he serves his clients who are all Mexicans, Mexican food, including like milanesa, tacos, huevos rancheros, refried beans, enchiladas, right? So kind of underscores like even when the Chinese are seen as incredibly foreign, they nevertheless are trusted with producing Mexican food. When World War II comes about, Chinese Mexicans don't participate in the war effort per se, but they do participate in a very limited way in what's called the Bracero program. The Bracero program, some of you might know, was a war contract, a labor contract between the United States and Mexico, where Mexicans went to the US to go work, right, during the Second World War. They mostly worked in agriculture, some worked on the railroad. And since there was a lack of supply of Mexican food for those Mexican workers, there was actually a company, Threkheld, that recruited Chinese Mexicans because they were seen as like not only able to like cook Mexican food in a way that the Mexicans wanted it, but also they could speak Spanish, right? So just 10 years after the end of the anti-Chinese movement, when these anti-Chinese activists swore that the Chinese would never fit into the Mexican nation, during World War II, they're seen as like emblematic of being Mexican, being able to provide Mexican culture for Mexicans overseas. And the reports generally chronicle how satisfied Mexican workers are with that arrangement, right? And with the food that the Chinese braceros are providing. I'm going to talk a little bit about a second example, and that's those people who arrived in Shanghai. So I mentioned that they arrived basically destitute. Most of them remained in China for about 30 years, not having any resources to be able to return to Mexico. A lot of them were deported or had to leave the country without documentation. And so the kind of paper chase made it really difficult to be able to prove that they were Mexican, to be able to re-enter Mexico, or to be able to hop on a boat to get back to Mexico. And so that made it really difficult for them to go back, and they were stuck in China. You can imagine the kind of fate of the Mexican women who arrive in Shanghai, don't speak Chinese, mostly don't speak English, find it really difficult to like survive and to find a social circle for themselves in really disastrous conditions. The mid-20th century for China was also a really tumultuous time, right? The Japanese invaded in 1937. The communist takeover was in 1949. So many of these families, because of war and civil war, end up in Hong Kong or in Macau. And that's where they spend, beginning in the 1940s into the 1950s, that's where they spend the remaining time continuously petitioning the Mexican government, like, you have to help us, you have to help us. We're stranded here. And they make a couple of arguments around this. One is the kind of state of war that they're in, the kind of threat of communism. But one of the main ones was how Mexican they were. Many of them had begun to congregate in a church in Hong Kong called the Asociación Hispanoamericana Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. And they used the Virgin of Guadalupe, their Catholic piety, and their sense of community to try to convince the Mexican government that they really are Mexican, even if they're a part of these like mixed Chinese Mexican families. Every December 12th, for example, they make the case that they go to Macau and they celebrate the feast day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, just like any other Mexican would. Many of these petitions to the Mexican government are written by a man by the name of Antonio Laimazo, who makes very similar arguments. He says, for example, that those who remain not only don't speak Chinese, they have very little knowledge of Chinese customs, right? They're Mexican through and through. And that, they're suffering as a result of the communism that's taking over China and the policies of Chairman Mao. And so he calls upon the Mexican government to take these people who are stranded, to liberate Mexicans from communist China, and to free them from the hardships and the persecution that they had faced under the new regime. And this ultimately works. In 1960, the Mexican government sends over a couple planes, says it's going to be their last and final effort to repatriate these people. So they go from this to this. This is a picture of some of the repatriates just as they're about to leave Macau. And they fly from southern China, from Hong Kong and Macau to Sinaloa. And from there, they sort of find the homes that they had left behind 30 years prior. So this, I think, was a really big turning point. And as during the 1950s and 1960s, as their case is getting more and more attention, it's clear that there's a greater acceptance of this possibility that like Chinese people could be Mexican or could have some sort of attachment to Mexico. And so this allows for those people who had remained in the country, who had never left, who kind of like avoided the anti-Chinese movement, to also be able to claim a certain sense of Mexicanness. And so this comes across especially during the pilgrimage to the Basilica of Guadalupe. Just like those who were in Hong Kong, who every 12th of December went to worship the Virgin of Guadalupe, the community in Mexico City was doing something very similar. This is a tradition that began in October of 1958 and has continued every October since. So the last Sunday, I believe, of every October, they get together in just outside the Zócalo, and they march holding up banners of the Virgin of Guadalupe all the way to the Basilica. And often along the way, there'll be like lion dances or dragon dances. And it's a way of like showcasing their own popular piety, but also their own Mexicanness, right? The Virgin of Guadalupe is really important to a sense of Mexicanidad. She's Mexico's patron saint. The Basilica of Guadalupe is one of Mexico's like most holiest Catholic sites. And so just the kind of silent depiction of their Catholic piety was also a way to assert that they were also Mexican, right? And since the Virgin, the Virgencita, was like the Empress of the Americas, it was also a way for themselves to assert that they were people of the Americas, and that they now fit in as Mexicans. In doing so, they were similar to any other group of faithful Mexican Catholics who had done this, but they choose to do it in a slightly different way, often through holding signs in Chinese, in dressing in a very Chinese way, and in engaging in these like lion and dragon dances. This is very consciously trying to get attention and to kind of showcase themselves not only as proud Mexicans, but also very much as Chinese, and to try to like change the perception of the Chinese that had been so prevalent during the 1930s, right? So if in the 1930s you have this perception that the Chinese were dirty, that they were carrying opium, that they were prone to violence, this depiction of Chinese Mexicans being like pious Catholics marching down the Calzada de Guadalupe presents them in a very different light and begins to overturn some of the earlier stereotypes around them. Every year, this pilgrimage made news in the leading Mexico City dailies, El Universal, Excelsior, and it made news all around the country, both in newsprint, but also on television and in newsreels, right? So this was like really closely followed around the country. A couple of really important social consequences follow from this. This was like a really important way for the Chinese Mexicans to be able to show their own visibility in the country. You know, after the anti-Chinese movement, there had been this like tendency to kind of lay low and to hope that violence wouldn't affect them again. And so this was really the first time that they said, okay, we really need to sort of step up on our own and really showcase ourselves in a way that, you know, is pretty vulnerable, but also takes a lot of courage, right? And by really kind of showcasing themselves so publicly, it allowed for the community to be able to organize in a really new way. So not only did the older generation organize through these pilgrimages, the younger generation was also able to showcase through dragon dancing and lion dancing, their like connections to Chinese culture. Lion dancing troops and dragon dancing troops began to be organized right around the end of the 1950s. And it was a way for Mexican Chinese youth to showcase their connections to Chinese culture, but also with one another. And these were organized by leaders of the Chinese Mexican community. Women were not left behind. Here we see another image of this lion dancing troupe in Mexico City. Women were not left behind, and there was the organization of both like dance troupes, but also these like lantern performance troupes that also performed not only during the pilgrimages, but also in like schools and universities in and around Mexico City. So kind of showcasing their Chineseness, but also their Mexicanness for these like really diverse audiences. And one of the dance troupes that was organized was the one that performed in Taiwan that I began this lecture with. So this pilgrimage towards the Basilica continues into the present day. It showcases, in some ways, how the community has evolved over the course of the kind of later part of the 20th century. If they were reluctant to participate in broad political activities early on, they definitely were willing to do so now, and willing to kind of speak pretty openly about the state of Chinese politics. The takeover of communism in China that had like implications for Catholicism in China, and their support at the time of Taiwan. Eventually, they began to kind of drop the political element and just to be much more openly Catholic. Right? And that's something that you see in more like modern pilgrimages. It's just like a celebration of Catholicism and of Mexicanness. So I'll just say a few things to conclude. These three elements that I've tried to analyze today, that's the Chinese contribution to Mexican cooking, the religious and nationalist fervor of the repatriates, and the Chinese pilgrimages to the Basilica, are all part of this much larger story of greater Chinese visibility and participation in Mexican society during the 20th century. And it's one that until recently, I think that we've lost, right? Jose Angel Espinosa, like his images have, because they're so sort of hateful but enduring, you know, a lot of the stories of the ways in which Chinese fit into Mexico have sort of been like papered over until relatively recently. And so the effort of my book was to recover some of those lost stories. I think that these stories demonstrate how the Chinese community in Mexico is able to maintain a sense of belonging to both Mexico and China. And it's notable that when the Chinese community makes this annual pilgrimage, when they make news headlines in major Mexican dailies or in newsreels, that they're not attacked for not being Chinese. That's something that you might have expected otherwise. They didn't attack the Catholic nature of these pilgrimages. They didn't attack them for their Spanish or for sort of not quite fitting in. They didn't attack them as foreigners. And so I would suggest that after the anti-Chinese movement, by the late 1950s and early 1960s, you see a complete sea change in the perception of Chinese Mexicans, that public hatred and suspicion of them had really gone away, and that Mexican society was much more willing to accept them as part of the Mexican nation. And I think this challenges the ways in which we, in our heads, conceive of Mexicanness, right? That even those who are not European, indigenous, or African can nevertheless find ways to fit into the Mexican nation. So I'll conclude here. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. Now's the time to ask questions. You have any? Here we have one by Andy in the chat section saying, did the Second World War unite Mexicans and Chinese American Mexicans?
Sort of. So Mexico and China were ostensibly allies during the Second World War. And so that actually boded quite well for the Chinese community. In contrast, the Japanese, sort of like they were in the US, were not in turn, but concentrated in certain parts of the country. That proved really disastrous, right? So the fact that China and Mexico were ostensibly allies helped out the status of the Chinese in the country. A couple things. In 1943, for the very first time, Chinese were able to regularize their immigration status. A lot of them didn't have legal documentation. And because they were allies, the Mexican government said, okay, you guys can just register and we'll forgive everything. The war itself wasn't a big deal in Mexico. Aside from the Bracero program, those of you guys who know Mexican history might know that Mexico sends like one squadron to the Philippines, but that's basically it. And so in terms of like war preparation, there wasn't a sort of big military alliance between Mexico and China, but for the community itself, socially, it paid a lot of dividends. That's a really great question.
Thank you, Fredy. We have another question here from PK. Can you please comment on the Chinatown in El Centro of Mexico City?
Yeah, so that Chinatown is Calle Dolores, and it is, so the foundation is of Chinese restaurants that spring up in the 1950s and 60s. It's only about a block long. It surrounds those restaurants, but ever since the the 1970s, it's been a sort of like rallying point, especially for the descendants of Chinese Mexicans to kind of gather. Every this holiday called Mid-Autumn Festival, and during Spring Festival, basically like in the fall and in the spring, the community will gather around and look at performances of Chinese dance. And it's like it's like the traditional kind of gathering point for all things Chinese Mexican. It's not really where the Chinese live. Descendants have moved out to the suburbs. There are like new Chinese immigrants that live in another colonia called Viaducto Piedad. So they live in like a different immigrant neighborhood. And so it's much more like Chinatown in theory, but it is like a really important, I think, gathering point and a really important monument for the Chinese community and for Chinese Mexican relations more generally.
Thank you. You mentioned that the Chinese population was the second largest immigrant community in the early 1900s. What was the first?
Yeah, great question. Americans during the late 19th century and early 20th moved to Mexico in really large numbers, invested a lot, especially in mining and railroads. And that created some of the resentment that led to the Mexican Revolution. There are also large populations of like Spaniards, Germans, French, and small populations of Japanese and Koreans.
Thank you. Question from Benjamin. What is the state of Chinese immigration to Mexico today? Does the history of Chinese Mexicans impact relations either positively or negatively between the countries?
So a couple things. Recently, the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, issued an apology, sort of on behalf of the state for what they called the aggravation against the Chinese community. It's been kind of a long time coming, and it's something that the community itself really wanted, especially those people who had been displaced by the repatriation and coming back. It was something that also was done, I think, in light of Mexico's relationship with China, right? So like during that apology, like the Chinese ambassador came and gave a speech basically saying like, it's all good. It was really interesting the way that played out. Relations between Mexico and China are pretty good and pretty cordial under the surface. There are immigrants who are coming into the country, especially around trade. There's a barrio of Mexico City called Tepito. And in and around Tepito, you get the kind of sale of lots of like imported goods, many of them from China. And so you've seen people who've come in with different states of documentation who primarily do like import export. There are also like many people who are kind of moving around the country, founding similar businesses. So like whenever I was doing my research, you would hear things like, you know, the Chinese are everywhere. And you would look around and there's like no Chinese, right? But like to people sort of feel this like latent xenophobia that I think is like springing up again. So I make the case in my book that that's something that we really need to keep an eye on. And that like, instead of apologies, the state really has this responsibility to prevent anything from happening again.
Thank you, Fredy. Another question came from Maureen. Can you delve a little more into effect of the Mexican Revolution on the Chinese Mexicans? And do you have any comments on Chinese in Zacatecas?
Zacatecas. I don't, unfortunately. I've seen regional studies on other states. So Chihuahua, for example, Tamaulipas. There's a great MA thesis on San Luis Potosí that I've seen. I haven't seen anything on Zacatecas, nor do I really know of like any kind of larger Chinese populations in Zacatecas that I would know of. Unfortunately not, but there might be, you know, one thing that I really benefited from is like local Mexican historians, especially many of them who are working like on a local level. You know, Chinese in any of these places or in like Mexicali or Tijuana, and they're just sort of like on the ground and able to really find sources, so that you might find something in Spanish. In terms of the revolution, beginning in 1911, in different parts of the country, law and order basically broke down. And this made the Chinese really vulnerable. And so at any sort of given point, they could be subject to a forced tax or a forced contribution, which basically means they got robbed and never paid back. They could be shot and killed. They could be threatened with like any number of horrors. And there really wasn't much they could do other than like try to hide or try to move somewhere else, right? And that really begins with the Torreon massacre. Unfortunately, that really continued up until 1917. And the government of Mexico was really kind of powerless to stop it. So there was a lot of like isolated incidents and a lot of vulnerability that affected the Chinese at that time.
Thank you, Fredy. Last couple of questions here. To what degree has Chinese Mexican involvement in Bracero program been studied, oral histories in particular?
I wrote an article about it. You're welcome to go find. I think it's called like Chinese Braceros. There isn't a lot, to be honest. There is a book on Mexican railroad braceros by a scholar by the name of Erasmo Gamboa who mentions them. And he engaged in a few oral histories of Mexicans. And so of non-Chinese Mexicans, I should say. And so they would sort of talk about the Chinese presence. For example, they like were harassed, teased, mocked quite a bit. Some quit because of the racism that they faced. And so he's kind of able to get at that angle. I wasn't able to find descendants of these Chinese Mexican braceros, and so wasn't able to get their stories. There's a great, just in terms of the Bracero program more generally, there's a Bracero History Archive, which some of you guys might be aware of, that involved, like teams of like young historians going to like pueblos in Mexico, going to like towns in California and elsewhere, and just going up to like older people and being like, tell us your stories, right? That's a fantastic resource. If you're interested in the Bracero program more generally, I love that resource. I assign it to my students a lot. I haven't seen much on the Chinese, but I'm hoping that something will pop up there eventually.
Thank you, Fredy. Finally, for anyone that's interested in more of your work, is it possible to find your book, Paisanos Chinos? Where can we find that?
I think Amazon. Libraries. Paisanos Chinos is being put out by UC Press. I do want to say the book has been translated into Spanish and will be put out by this press, Palabra de Clio. The website is palabradeclio.mx. And that will be free. It'll be completely, open access. So if you wait a couple of months, I think you'll be able to find it in Spanish there. Otherwise, thank you. Otherwise, Amazon or UC Press would be a good place to find it, or your local library.
Thank you, Fredy. I put a link there in the chat for you to UC Press.
Thank you.
Thank you once again for all the information. It's a very interesting subject that I didn't know about. So enjoyed it a lot. Thank you everyone who came out today or joined us here on Zoom. Find our other Latinx Heritage Month events on our MOLA events page, which I will paste into the chat section now. And then here I see someone asking about the resource you mentioned earlier about the Bracero. If you happen to have a link to that, people might want to see that in the chat. Ready? But yes, thank you to everyone that showed up. We hope to see you in our next program. And I'll keep this open for a little longer while people click on these links.